Okay. So, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Apostle Kolade Akin, and I'm the Missions Director for Europe for the Charismatic Renewal Ministries Incorporated. And today we are having another episode of our wonderful program, Macedonia Call Revisited. And why are we doing this program is because last year, while we were praying at the Intercessors Camp for our ministry in Europe, with the brethren in Europe, the Lord began to speak to us about going back to the foundation of the gospel in Europe. And we began to investigate, what is that? What does that mean? We initially thought it had to do with the foundation of what we were doing as a ministry. But as we began to pray, God began to grant us a bit more insight. And that insight began to tell us that we needed to visit some specific places in terms of prayer, in terms of understanding what went wrong. Because many times people look at what happened to Europe. The gospel came into Europe through Apostle Paul, but the gospel was re-engineered also in Europe. You know, Europe has got the mantle of Japhet. That means the mantle of expansion. Everything they touch, they expand. If you look at it, education expanded. If you look at finances, if you look at banking, if you look at law, if you look at governance, if you look at academics, if you look at sports, everything that comes into Europe expands. Also, if evil lands in Europe, it expands. And that's what we've seen across the nations of the world. So when Europe took over slavery, you see how they expanded it as well. So everything Europe touches expands. And you can see the issues, the social issues that are happening across the world today. Europe is playing a major role. If it's got to do with anything, Europe plays a central role. And God is saying, if there's going to be the last revival, will also have Europe at the center of it. But that will not happen until the altars that were raised, the potent altars, until those altars are revisited and realigned. If you remember, when Jeremiah was going to pray with the prophets of Baal, the first thing he did when he encountered them, when that showdown was going to get to its final stage, the first thing he did was to rearrange the altar of the Lord. In rearranging the altar of the Lord, he now began to pray, and then fire came down. Europe is not going to be revived until we go back to the altar. That altar was raised by God because God sent Apostle Paul specifically into Europe. The gospel did not come through any other means. It came as a result of obedience. So this morning, wherever you're watching us from, I have with me today one of the members of our team, the Mission to Europe team, a very wonderful man of God. We've been working together for quite a long time now, and his name is Brother Henry Nwokeocha. He is going to be joining me this morning as we look at another aspect, in terms of an insight that God has been giving to him and to us over the last few weeks regarding this assignment into Europe. So let me welcome specifically Minister Henry Nwokeocha. God bless you, sir. You're welcome powerfully. How are you doing? How is your area?
Yeah, the Lord is helping us. Thanks so much for having me in this show. And I strongly believe that the Lord in His mercy will minister to His people.
Yeah.
And just to continue from where you stopped, and the principle of expansion, and whatever comes into Europe expands. And I strongly see that same pattern in scriptures. And I'll be drawing our attention to what the Lord dropped in my heart while I was praying this morning concerning Europe. And I will take us straight to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew 16 verse 5, scripture says, and when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Verse 6, then Jesus said to them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I'm reading from New King James Version. That leaven there is interpreted, take heed of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And because of time, if you read down, the disciples began to argue and say, have we forgotten to take bread? And Jesus had to strongly rebuke them by saying in verse 9, do you not understand or remember that I multiplied 5 loaves into 5,000 and also multiplied 7 loaves into 4,000. Verse 11 says, and how is it that you do not understand? I do not speak to you concerning bread. Rather, I speak to you concerning yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, yeast. So I just want us to have that in mind, that yeast, one of the principles of yeast is you put yeast into a dough and it makes it swell. So the principle of yeast, if you go through scripture, even when Paul was talking to the church in Corinth about yeast, he talks about evil. And if yeast is not being controlled, it makes the whole bunch of loaf of bread swell. So just mark that word, the yeast of the Pharisee. And I'll take us straight also to the Gospel of Matthew. That's in Matthew chapter 15, verse 1. Then the scribes and the Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, Why do your disciples transgress the traditions of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. So you see from Matthew 16, verse 5, Jesus talks about the yeast of the Pharisees. Then you go to Matthew 15, verse 1 and 2, it talks about the traditions of the Pharisees, the ways of life of the Pharisees. Then you just keep reading in Matthew 15, verse 9. And Jesus Christ says, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandment of men. He was still referring to the Pharisees. So you see 3 levels there. You see the yeast. And if yeast is not being controlled, yeast refers to error. If error is not being controlled, it matures into a tradition. And if that tradition is not managed, it matures into a doctrine. And that is the state of Europe today. And we strongly believe that God in His mercy is raising a Josiah generation that will not just handle the doctrines, but will go to the roots to uproot the yeast. Because it was the yeast that gave birth to traditions, and traditions gave birth to doctrines. This same principle is also highlighted in the book of Jude, Peter, and also Revelation. And Jesus Himself spoke about it. So let me just read the scripture very quickly for us in Jude 1 verse 11. Jude 1 verse 11. In Jude 1 verse 11, and Jude writing to the church, and he says, Woe to them, for they have gone the way of Cain, and they have greedily followed the error of Balaam. The error of Balaam. And an error is something that looks small. So error also represents yeast in this case. So I will just try to draw a parallel between Balaam and the Pharisees, the error of Balaam. Then we'll now begin to relate that into the topic we have this morning about the altars in Europe and how God is raising a generation called the Josiah generation to uproot those altars. So we see the error of Balaam. Then you just have to go just behind 2 Peter 2 verse 13. In 2 Peter 2 verse 13, in 2 Peter 2 verse 13 says,
And you shall receive the reward of unrighteousness, as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime. Sports they are, and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings, while they feast with you.
Yeah, don't even read down, but because of time, just read verse 15, if you don't mind, please.
Verse 15.
Yes, sir.
It says, which have forsaken the right way, and are gone astray, following the way of Balaam the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness.
So you see from the error of Balaam into the way of Balaam. So the error of Balaam can be related to the yeast of the Pharisee. The way of Balaam can be related to the traditions of the Pharisee. Then I will now read the words of Jesus Himself in Revelation 2 verse 14. Revelation 2 verse 14. Revelation 2 verse 14. Jesus Himself speaking. He says, but I have a few things against you, because Because you there have those who have held on to the doctrine of Balaam. So you see 3 levels. You see the error of Balaam. You see the way or the traditions of Balaam, and you now see the doctrine of Balaam. You relate that to where we read in the book of Matthew, Jesus himself speaking. We talk about the yeast of the Pharisee. In Matthew 15, where we read verse 8, 9, just spoke about the yeast became the teachings. So we have the yeast of the Pharisees, we have the doctrine of the tradition of the Pharisees, and we have the doctrine of the Pharisees. So you see 3 levels of how an error, if it's not stopped, becomes a doctrine, becomes a tradition. And if that tradition is not managed, it becomes a doctrine. And this morning while I was praying, for the first time ever since I got saved, the Spirit of God spoke into my heart. I have never heard this word before. And the Spirit of God says to me, and I went through scriptures, and it was confirmed in scripture, that idolatry came into Israel by the man who held the highest post in Israel, talking about Aaron the high priest. Because after God brought Israel from Egypt, and the first thing God wanted to do was to cut a covenant with them on Mount Sinai. And you can see that in Exodus 19, 20, 24. In Exodus 34, when Moses went up to get the Ark of the Testament, and Moses and Aaron fashioned a calf. And surprisingly, Aaron said, "This is the God that brought you out of Egypt." And if you now look at that story, about 500 years later, Jeroboam, the first king of the divided kingdom, brought forth a calf again, same like the one Aaron brought forth. And he made the same statement Aaron made. "This is the God that brought you out of Egypt." So you now see an error that was done by Aaron has now become a tradition by Jeroboam, this same calf. And because it was not stopped, it continued through all the whole about 20 kings that ruled the northern kingdom. So you now see that if an error is not managed, it becomes a tradition. And if it's not managed, it becomes a doctrine. And that is the state of Europe. And you mentioned as you began this section about Paul the Apostle and how he got into Philippi in his second missionary journey, in his first missionary journey when he began in Acts 13 in Antioch. He went through Lystra, Iconium. In Acts 14, he came back. In Acts 15, him, Barnabas, went to Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Council. And after he had a separation with Barnabas, as a result of John Mark, he now went to Lystra in Acts 16 and picked Timothy. At that point, Luke, who was the writer of Acts of the Apostles, joined them. Because that's the point you see Luke began to use the word we. So clearly showing that at that point Luke joined them. So Luke joined Paul in his second missionary journey. And as you stated, Paul began to pray. And Paul wanted to go into Asia Minor. And the Bible says the Spirit of God restricted him not to go into Asia Minor. And he had a vision, and he saw a man calling forth from Macedonia. And scripture says, and Luke writing says, we now decided, knowing fully well that God in his mercy is now sending us into Europe. And they got into Philippi. And when I read that scripture, I was going through Acts of the Apostles 16 to look for who is that man that actually appeared to Paul. And from my study, and I surely believe that it was the hunger that was in Europe that was crying forth. And that hunger was satisfied in a woman called Lydia.